My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and I have seen The War of the Rohirrim, and this is going to be my review. Before I get to that, a few housekeeping matters. Because I am releasing this, during the weekend, I'm not going to be doing a normal Monday release. This is basically my weekly release for the week, so don't expect another one for another week until next Monday. Another point here is I would have tried to get this out sooner, but I literally got home at about midnight after watching the movie because I couldn't get an earlier showing because I had so many other things going on. This is literally as fast as I could get this out, and I had a bunch of stuff going on Saturday as well because, okay, sorry if it took longer than you would have liked, but I got it done as fast as I could, okay? So, before I get to the actual review, here's how I'm kind of going to do it. I'm going to talk about a couple of really basic things up front, and then I'm going to talk about what I liked and disliked, not necessarily in that order. It's going to be kind of free-flowing, and then I'm going to save spoiler-type stuff for the end. Now, anybody who's super familiar with the actual story from the Lord of the Rings appendices is not going to be able to be spoiled too much on the actual main story, obviously. But there are things that were added, changed, whatever, that if you don't want those spoiled, skip the last part of the video. I will let you know when that is going to start so you can stop watching if you want. Also, one final thing before I get started. I always have difficulty really deciding how much I like a movie after the first viewing and, the first couple days. So when I tell you what my overall rating for this movie is, that's probably not going to be a permanent thing. It's probably going to be in flux a little bit. I will probably end up watching this movie at least one or two more times in some form or fashion. Maybe I'll get it on video. Maybe I'll just catch it on streaming. Depends on how I feel whenever that option becomes available. But it's definitely one that I would like to watch a second time before coming up with a absolutely final opinion. But I do have at least a pretty good idea of where it falls. So take the review in terms of whether it's good with a slight grain of salt, but overall I think this is going to be a pretty fair and accurate review. And with that said, let's get started with a few housekeeping things. First housekeeping thing to note is this movie is not necessarily for everyone. And by that I mean it is an anime movie, and as with many anime movies, it comes with a couple of downsides. One of those is the violence in it is slightly more graphic than what you would see even in Peter Jackson's trilogy. I mean, Peter Jackson had its moments, like when Lurtz gets his head cut off by Aragorn at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. There are moments in this movie that are slightly more aggressive than that, but it's not horrible for an anime movie. I mean, it's not like it's an R-rated thing. And another one is there are two uses of the D word. So parents, if you're thinking about having your kids watch this movie and you have a problem with the D word, there are at least two uses of that in the movie, so be aware. So who is this movie for? It is very much, for adults, but it's not like a lot of anime movies are extremely adult only. So it's definitely in the category of any adult would feel comfortable watching it. There's nothing really out there in it. So it still fits, pretty firmly within the, Middle-earth movie, kind of universe in terms of watchability. The only thing I will say, though, about the D word being included twice is it's so out of character for Middle-earth that it was one of the things that I didn't like, but I'm just mentioning it now because I'm on the topic. Another thing, the anime style, I should mention up front, is not one that I particularly like. I mentioned this before when I talked about the trailer. I'm not a huge fan of anime. I like animated movies more in the style of like the 90s Disney or, the Rankin Bass Hobbit and Return of the King, that kind of stuff. I'm not a huge fan of anime, so that's going to affect in some degree how much I like this movie. Your mileage may vary, but with that said, I can kind of start getting into the likes and dislikes about the movie, because one of the things that I definitely did not like was some of the animation style, and not just the fact that it was anime. For one thing, the actual flow of the animation felt very choppy to me, especially early in the movie. I'm not sure if it was choppier earlier or if it just was something that I got used to as the movie went along. But it looked, especially in the early parts of the movie, almost like I was watching a video with a bad frame rate. And, that's not fun. Every now and then I'll have a video that glitches that I upload, and it's like, well, sorry, the frame rate's terrible, but something went wrong and I can't really redo it. And that's not fun to watch, I know, but sometimes it happens. And in this particular instance, it obviously didn't have to happen. It's animation. They had over a year of production on this movie. So it just felt really... I didn't like it. I did not like the frame rate, so to speak, of the animation flow. So that's one thing I didn't like. Similarly, in terms of the animation, I did not particularly like some of the choices they made with how they combined, and this is complicated because I'm not exactly sure what they did, but I have a pretty good guess. Obviously, the characters and stuff are all cel-shaded anime-type animation. A lot of the backgrounds, though, are what look to be CGI, and in particular, it looks a lot like they are basically photos that have been digitized and then kind of turned into moving objects with computer, technology. And some of the shots, in terms of the backgrounds, are actually really beautiful. Like, we get the opening shot is we get this sweeping view of, first it's a colored map of Middle Earth that looks drawn, but then it kind of turns into what looks like actual, like, live action shots of mountains that it's just flying over, kind of like you might get at the opening of the Two Towers. But then it becomes clear that it's actually CGI, but it looks so photorealistic that I think what they did was they actually took video or photo of mountains and then just computerized it. I don't know. Like, I didn't, look up any information about this movie before I went into it. I tried to avoid all stuff that I could. And just trying to get just as fresh an opinion as I can off the bat. But the opening shot we get turns into a sweep over a landscape, and then we see, animated characters over it, and the contrast of that was so jarring. If you've seen a lot of animated shows of any kind, you'll know a lot of the time that moving objects in an animation will be brightly colored compared to backgrounds that are dark that don't move, right? And it was kind of that same type of contrast, except the contrast was greater because it wasn't brightly colored hand-drawn versus more dimly colored hand-drawn. It was hand-drawn versus whatever this other thing was. And it was kind of weird getting used to that. I wasn't a huge fan of it. I'd rather they had just done hand-drawn for the entire thing, and I'm pretty sure they didn't. But as I mentioned, some of those shots are really gorgeous. Like, we get this shot of the mountains, we get another shot very late in the movie of a sunrise or a sunset, I forget which one, that looks really gorgeous. And there's stuff like that where you get, really good detailed backgrounds and things like that. So, I mean, some of it's good, but I just did not like the combination of the two. But again, whatever your animation preferences are, your mileage may vary. Also, on the visual aspect of things, I should of course point out, and this is probably obvious to most people, most of the visuals in here are directly lifted from the Peter Jackson Two Towers type Rohan stuff, right? Mediceld looks the same, Helm's Deep looks pretty much the same. All this stuff looks very Peter Jackson Middle Earth, very clearly. The one exception to that, basically, is some of the armor that the main characters wear, and by main characters, I mean Helm, Hama, Haleth, and Hera, that family, and a few other, maybe, of the Lords of Rohan. They wear armor that is much less like the traditional kind of chainmail stuff that they're wearing in the Lord of the Rings movies, and a lot more like, say, Fire Emblem characters. And I mean, literally, like when you see Helm in his armor for the first time, you would almost swear he was like a general or a great knight or something from the Fire Emblem series, because that's kind of what his armor resembles. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just go, look up Fire Emblem 8 and get some imagery. Yeah, so I mean, the character designs for some of the main characters stands out as being a lot less connected to the movies than most everything else. And it's not horrible in the sense that it really draws you away, but it was a little bit, if you pay attention to that kind of stuff, you're going to be a little kind of weirded out by it, maybe, because just the style of clothing and armor is really very different for some people compared to others, which is kind of a weird choice. But, again, it's anime. It's kind of comes with the territory a little bit. So other things that I like and dislike about this movie, let's talk about the plot, but not, obviously, spoiler-type plot. The plot pretty well stuck to the main plot of the actual written version of the story, with some exceptions. They did make some changes that I found both unnecessary and kind of not exactly... It doesn't create exactly a contradiction or anything, but it does make some things kind of weird. And my wife, who saw the movie with me, actually commented on this too. The way the conflict gets set up at the beginning of the film is a little bit different than the way it starts at the beginning in the appendices, and as a result, the movie version feels a lot less natural. And my wife even pointed this out, not knowing the original story. So even she, going in as somebody who knew nothing, had the view that, it wasn't a great start to the movie because the way the conflict sets up seems a bit unnatural. After we get past that point, there's not a whole lot of problems with the plot itself, except, we do have to have a few things kind of added in a little bit and created for purposes of the movie, because the movie is about Hera. I mean, let's just come out and say it. They not exactly invent, because Helm does have a daughter, and that is at the heart of some of the conflict. But in the story as written, she's not named, and she only gets mentioned once as the potential wife of Wolf, Freka's son. I'm spoiling nothing if you know anything about, the actual story. So, I mean, I'm assuming everybody here has at least had the opportunity to read the appendices. If you haven't, then I may be spoiling that for you, but I'm not worried about spoiling that because you've had years to catch up on that. That's your problem. So, in the written story, that's the only time she's mentioned. Well, this movie is all about Hera, and by that I don't mean there is a obsessive focus on her, but she is very definitely the main character. Like, everything is kind of from her perspective, in the sense of, in the way that we follow along with Frodo and Sam for the most part through the Lord of the Rings. She is that character in this movie. Helm is a secondary character compared to Hera, and then everybody else is tertiary after that, arguably. I mean, there's other characters you could name as secondary, and I'll get to that a little bit. But some of the story gets altered a little bit in order to accommodate the fact that we're seeing all this through kind of her eyes, in a sense. It's not a first-person narrative, obviously, but she's the primary character through whom the story gets told. And as a result, some of the story changes that come up are just, unnecessary, obviously, because you could have told the story without having to go through all that. You could have told the story through the lens of, the characters that are actually named in the book. But most of it is not really a problem, although there are definitely things in there that were added that I think were just unnecessary. There were also several subplots, which I'll talk about these in more detail later, that get thrown in, which just seemed like a complete waste of time. And on that note, this movie runs at about 2 hours once you cut out credits. And once you get to that 2 hours, it's not a hugely long movie. I mean, by Middle-earth movie standards these days, that's fairly short. But it does drag a little because of these handful of subplots that get thrown in there that add nothing really to the main plot. And by add nothing, I mean, like, some of them are just downright weird. You even wonder why it's there in the first place. It feels like some kind of point is trying to be made, but it felt lost on me anyway. So some of these subplots are just kind of bizarre and unnecessary, and some of them even create minor problems in some ways. But again, I'll talk about that more later because that really is movie spoilers. The other thing about the story that I will point out is that overall, if I had to rank this in terms of how much it deviates from the written material compared to other Middle-earth movies, it's definitely not as accurate as the Rankin Bass Hobbit. It's really not even as accurate as the Return of the King by Rankin Bass, because the Rankin Bass didn't change a lot. They just cut out a lot due to time. There's also a lot that's just you have to kind of generate in some ways to make Hera the main character, so some of that is you could definitely accept as just, creative license without a problem. But you got probably on the scale of like the worst offenders versus, the best, most accurate, I'd say it probably falls somewhere around like Peter Jackson, Two Towers, or Return of the King level of deviation from source material. It's kind of hard to compare that because in terms of the characters, we can't compare how the characters act too much directly to the story because we get so little characterization in the story. Helm's nephew Freylof is barely mentioned at all towards the end. His sons Haleth and Hama are basically just brought up to say that they died in battle. Helm is characterized a little bit. Freka is characterized a little bit. Hera is not characterized at all. So you can't really compare in terms of characterization that much, but you can compare plot points. And so in terms of plot points, I would say it's somewhere in that realm. There's things that it changes that are kind of egregious, but it's not absolutely horrible. So, that's kind of where that falls. Speaking of characterization, one of the things that I found kind of disappointing, despite a 2-hour runtime, is that we get several characters who get very little characterization at all, who are more prominent in the written story than they are than Hera is in the written story. Haleth and Hama get a little bit of characterization, but not a lot. Freylof gets mentioned. Not mentioned. He has actually a character throughout the movie, and he gets some characterization, but he takes a serious back seat. The primary characters that we see are Hera, Helm, a maid who is kind of Hera's maid, a boy that is kind of tasked with being her guard at one point, Wolf, obviously. Freka is not a major character because he dies within, first 10, 15 minutes of the movie. But he's at least kind of a major character. And then there's another Dunlending character who's kind of a major character. But the only two characters that really receive much dedicated time are Hera and Helm, and then a little bit on her maid and the young Rohirrim boy that kind of is with her some of the time. Beyond that, there's just not a lot of characterization. And even Helm and some of these other minor characters that kind of got created, they're not characterized a whole lot. And that's why I say, like, Hera is the main character. We spend so much of our time with her that we have very little time to spend with almost anybody else. And that's kind of disappointing, especially because so much of the time that we spend with Hera could have been with other characters, but there's several subplots where she ends up being separated from other characters, and therefore we're just getting her by herself. I will say, before it sounds like I'm criticizing this too much, there is definitely, and even my wife said this, that the movie was a bit girl bossy, but not obsessively so. It wasn't so extreme that it was just in your face, horrible, but it is definitely a Hera-centric movie, and the movie is all about her, and we get that throughout the movie. And it's, if you're okay with that, that's not a problem, and I'm okay with it in the sense that if it's a movie about Hera, it's a movie about Hera. But as I said, it kind of cuts everybody else way short. And if you're interested in an actual accurate representation of the story from the Tolkienian writings, it's not really accurate because we get her mentioned one time minimally, and then we don't really hear about her at all again. And then, we don't get, like I said, a whole lot of characterization at all in the book itself, but to the extent that we get any activity going on, the main characters are kind of in order: Helm, Wolf, Halathama, Freloff. And that's it. And then the other characters are either there for a very short time or barely mentioned at all. So Hera is not like an overweening girl boss, but the fact that she takes up so much of the movie space cuts away from the fact that if you were going into this hoping to get the story of Helm Hammerhand, you're not. You're just not. So there's that. But overall plot and characters, that's kind of the main points. Other points to mention in terms of things I liked and didn't like, I will say that there are moments in the movie that are very explicit callbacks to the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, and it's not a hugely overdone thing. For one thing, and as an example, the song that Éowyn sings at Theodred's funeral gets reused in this movie. I don't think it's Miranda Otto singing it, but it's hard to tell. It's definitely not like they just copied that audio from the film trilogy and ported it. It sounds different, so I can't tell who was actually singing it, but they reused the song. And there's several other references. There's lines that get pulled from the Lord of the Rings and ported into this movie into different places. That it's not egregious, but there were definitely several. Some of the worst of these, and this is not really much of a spoiler if you've seen the trailer, but I will just say, if you haven't even seen the trailer, maybe skip the next 20 seconds. There is the whole Watcher in the Water scene, and that subplot has zero bearing on anything really in the story, and yet there it is because it's a reference to the Lord of the Rings movies. That's, as far as I could tell, that's the only purpose for throwing that in there. And I just found that kind of annoying. And then one of the other things that you'll have seen from the trailer is that there's eagles flying around. And the eagles is another kind of unnecessary thing that was just like, why are they here? They kind of make a big deal out of them, but then they don't. It was just kind of bizarre. And they do use an eagle for a subplot later on, which I'll talk about, but it wasn't really necessary. And these things are all, like I said, these are callbacks to the movies and or the text of the Lord of the Rings, that some of them are just completely unnecessary, and then some of them are, they're perfectly fine, but, just kind of in a different spot here for whatever reason. Like the song that Éowyn sings in the film trilogy that gets reused, it's a song of lament. It makes sense that it gets used where it gets used in this film, so I don't have a problem with that. Who cares? If it's a traditional song of the Rohirrim for the dead, cool. There's no reason why it wouldn't be used. But there are things that do get ported over that, it's like, you just really did that for the nostalgia bait. That's really all you did that for. And those kinds of things annoy me, but it wasn't huge. It wasn't, just to give you a comparison, like the Rings of Power Season 1, it seemed like they did that 2 or 3 times every episode to be like, aha, movie moment, or aha, Lord of the Rings thing that ended up here. It wasn't that egregious in this movie. There were several, but they were pretty spaced out, and they were mostly pretty minor and not a big deal. But there were a few that were just like, why? So, another thing that was kind of like, not a huge fan of. In terms of voice acting, the voice actors, pretty much did a really good job. Brian Cox as Helm Hammerhand, I think was not as good as I was hoping he was going to be, but he still, he did fine. It works perfectly well, and I think that has less to do with Brian Cox as an actor and more to do with the fact that the way that they, the lines that they gave him and whatnot were not the kind of thing I was expecting from Helm Hammerhand, let's say. So it's not so much that Brian Cox is not a good enough actor or he was the wrong choice for the role. It's the way they wrote his character, I don't think gave him really the best opportunity to use his talent for it. Other than that, I mean, most of the voice acting is perfectly fine. I will just say that the young boy, if I remember his name is Leaf, who is kind of one of the minor characters throughout the movie, it's funny because his voice sounds kind of adult, and Hama's voice, Hama being the younger son of Helm, his voice sounds less adult than the boy's, even though he's clearly an adult. So some of the choices they made in terms of the acting was a little weird, to me anyway, personally. On that note as well, I will just mention that Leaf, this young boy, he is, short in terms of his height. He's probably, I'd say, if I was guesstimating, 4'4" to 4'8". He's clearly not full grown, but he's not just a kid. He's not like an 8-year-old. That said, he's got a very round physique, let's say, which is kind of out of keeping with, the culture that he's in. And he also is just very reminiscent of a hobbit in a lot of strange ways. And I wonder if that was deliberate. This is another one of those things that I I kind of wonder if it was a kind of a member-berry type thing, and I wasn't a huge fan of it. It's like you could have had somebody there who didn't look anything at all like a hobbit, who just looked like an ordinary page of age 12 to 14 and been perfectly fine, but they made him look like a hobbit, and it's just like, what are you doing there? And then there's some other things. One of the things that you will have noticed is if you watch the trailer, one of the things that you'll have noticed is that at one point Hera is wearing what looks like a wedding dress, and if you're watching just the trailer, you don't know why, and I'll get to this and explain it a little bit. But the thing I don't like about the wedding dress, my wife pointed out that actually prior to Victorian England, white wedding dresses were actually not the norm. I didn't know that, so interesting trivia for you all that even I didn't know. But the thing that I didn't like about it, which I thought was very, again, not period, not fitting to the culture that we're, in this story, is when she wears it, we get a shot from when she first puts it on, we see her from the back, and it's got this plunging, backline, like down to her lumbar spine. So like a whole lot of her back is just bare. And this is in the middle of winter that she's doing this, so it's kind of a bizarre thing to do. But also just that style of dress would not have been worn in anything like a medieval culture. And medieval is basically what we're doing here, right? So I wasn't a huge fan of that just from a pseudo-historical accuracy type of standpoint. I mean, other than that, it was okay, I guess. But it was just things like that, it draws me out of the suspension of disbelief a little bit, because I'm looking at that going, that doesn't fit everything else going on in this movie. Now, I mean, if you're not aware of that kind of stuff, it's not going to stand out to you and it's not a big deal, but to me it does. So, another one of those things. And on that note, I already mentioned the armor looking kind of like Fire Emblem and not the traditional chainmail, right? Well, that's another thing that doesn't really fit, because even in the Lord of the Rings trilogy that Peter Jackson did, they're all wearing chainmail, which is very period. It makes a lot of sense. Here it's, plate mail was not a thing in either Tolkien or the early medieval period, so it's kind of bizarre to see a bunch of people wearing basically plate. Now, I mean, yes, in the trilogy there are a few people who wear some degree of plate, like Theoden and Éomer, but, different kind of story. On that note, I should also mention that in Helm's Deep, even though it's clearly based on the movie trilogy version of Helm's Deep, the gate of the Hornburg is very different. Instead of being just a gate that swings open like traditional doors, it's this thing that it's like huge, I guess, metal. I don't know if it's metal or wood, but they're doors that slide open into slots in the wall, which I don't have a problem with per se. I mean, this was a thing built by Numenorians, and therefore their technology would have been insanely good compared to everybody else in Middle-earth. But it just seemed like a weird clash with the movies, since we're clearly basing the whole look of Helm's Deep on what the movies did. Why would you change the gate? And it's not like it's just a minor thing that we just kind of skip over. They actually spend a lot of time with this gate when they first arrive and at another point in the movie, and it's like, why spend so much time on this gate that we're going to make completely different than what is in the movie when that's clearly what we're basing our imagery off of? It just seemed kind of strange. So those are kind of like my main points in terms of everything that goes on in the movie in terms of what I like and dislike before I get to spoilers. I mean, the anime style is one that is not necessarily bad. I just don't like the extreme, like I said, frame rate issues, so to speak, and I didn't like the contrast of the cel-shaded versus what seems to be CGI. Overall, though, the art style I like the character designs, that kind of thing. And the voice acting was, for the most part, really good, other than a few kind of strange choices, I thought. So, I mean, overall, given that this movie doesn't just egregiously go against what Tolkien put in the appendices and everything else I've mentioned, my initial assessment of this movie is probably like a 7 out of 10. I would definitely watch it again. And depending on, like I said, how time changes how I think about it, that may change, and I may, it may end up watching it several more times, and I may end up, maybe watching it one more time and deciding, it wasn't really worth it after all. But at least right now, it's definitely higher in my opinion than Rings of Power, for sure. When I first reviewed Rings of Power's the first 2 episodes, because they did the premiere at the theaters, I rated that probably in a 6 to 7 range, if I remember right. This, I think, was better than that, because there's not a whole lot of meandering storylines. There's not a lot of the problems that you get in Rings of Power, but it does have its issues. Now let's start talking about the actual plot points and spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie yet and you're planning to and you don't want spoilers, this is where you cut it off. This is where I'm going to start talking about differences between the book and movie and explain some of what I meant by things that I don't like about the plot. So for starters, we get this opening kind of introduction by Miranda Otto. She's kind of narrating and talking about things, and I think this was in at least one of the trailers that she kind of gives this line about there's this older story than the War of the Ring, and there's this woman who did great things, but don't expect to hear about her. She's not in any songs. I'm not sure why they put that line in there, because it almost seems like they're digging at Tolkien for being a chauvinist or something and not giving the females credit, when it's like, he totally did, but if Hera had been the daughter of Helm and had done all this awesome stuff, he probably would have wrote about that, because he wasn't afraid to give females prominent roles and have them do epic things like kill the Witch King. So, annoying thing number 1, right? And that sets the tone for the movie, unfortunately, which doesn't help. But I will say, after the initial part of the movie, which was kind of weak, it gets a lot better, and then, it has a few issues at the end that are kind of weird, but the opening of the movie was probably the worst part. If you can get past the first 15 minutes, it's not too egregious for the rest of it. Most of, I think, some of the worst stuff is actually in the opening section of the movie, weirdly enough. But anyway, we get this, and we get this opening scene where she is riding around, and there's a couple of eagles flying over. She rides up to the top of this hill and pulls out this huge, I can only assume it's like a cow leg, but it's without skin. It's just the meat. And she throws it into the air for one of the eagles to catch, and it comes and lands, and she like tries to touch it, and it goes bah, like screams at her and knocks her down, and she's like, okay, I guess I'm not allowed to touch. And it'll become a little more clear why the eagles are involved later, but at this point in the movie, it just seems kind of strange because why is she just friendly with eagles? That's not really a thing that we hear about being a thing in Lord of the Rings. Radagast is friendly with eagles, and some of the other wizards are in contact with eagles, but it doesn't seem like they're just constantly talking with, blowjo humans, right? Galadriel apparently has some contact with eagles and, that kind of thing, but it seems like they only really get in touch with major players in Middle-earth because they keep to themselves and they just do their thing. Anyway, she then rides back to Edoras, and Hama, who is apparently a minstrel to some degree because he's playing a lute or a harp or a whatever. He's actually singing a song, which I appreciate, actually. This is one of the things that I do appreciate, is the fact that we do get some actual singing in this movie that's not just like the Éowyn funeral song. We get him singing. What I didn't particularly like is that he's singing the "Where Now Is the Horse and the Rider," and they changed the words so that it's basically about Hera. And I'm like, why'd you do that? Anyway, she meets him, and he basically tells her that Freka has called a council. And she says, well, isn't only the king the one that can do that? And then we get this other minor character introduced, which is her maid. Her name is Olwen, I think. It was not always 100% clear from the audio, but it sounded like Olwen. And she says, well, that's the custom, but it's not the law. And so anyway, we get Freka, apparently, who's calling the council, which is not how it goes in the book. In the book, it's, Helm calls councils, and then sometimes Freka shows up, sometimes he doesn't. But anyway, Freka calls this one for, we don't know what reason yet. So Hera has to get changed. And she's like, what's wrong with what I'm wearing? And of course, she's wearing a riding outfit. And Olwen's just kind of gives her this look like, really? But anyway, she does get changed into a court-appropriate dress, let's say. And she ends up making her way to the council, and which seems kind of weird in and of itself. Why is she being part of the council? I mean, maybe that would have been normal, maybe it wouldn't have. We don't get anything from Tolkien on this, but, the idea from Tolkien's writing is that the king calls councils, and they talk about things that are just pertinent to the nation or war or whatever. And it doesn't really seem like that would be a natural thing for her to be a part of, but hey, whatever, she's there. And her brothers are also there, and we meet Haleth, the older brother, on the way to the council. And we get there, and then Helm kind of starts the council before Freka even shows up. He doesn't really start it, but then Freka kind of walks in and basically says, you started without me, which is, this is where we get into that business of the way it all gets started. It goes a little sideways compared to the book and doesn't make quite as much sense, but it gets worse. Because basically what ends up happening, he's got his son Wolf with him, and this General Targ, who's one of the other minor characters, who's apparently a general from Dunland. And he, Helm, after he says, I see you got started without me, he basically says, he says you've been cutting back on something. I think he says you've been cutting back on showing up to council meetings, but not your diet or something to that effect, which is kind of what happens in the book, because Helm does basically call him fat obliquely, but it happens in a different way, because in the book it all gets started when at the council he brings up the marriage, and then Helm, kind of jabs back at him as being like, you're getting too big for your boots, is kind of the feel of how he responds. And in that context, he says, you're basically getting fat. He doesn't use those words. Here, Helm starts with that before we get any mention from Freka about why he called the council or anything. So it seems kind of backwards. But anyway, oh, and I forgot to mention, before everything got started with the actual council, we meet Leaf, the young boy, and he's supposed to announce everybody, and he's learning these sigils, and there's one that's kind of like burnt out, and one of them comes up and says, oh, that's the sigil of the Shield Maidens, and there's apparently this story about a group of women who, after all the soldiers were dead, took up arms and defended themselves, and this is supposed to explain what a Shield Maiden of Rohan is, and okay, but sure, whatever. Moving on. It turns out, by the way, that Olwen is one of these women. And we don't find that out immediately exactly, but it gets mentioned, like, I don't think there's any left. Well, they're not all gone. Well, Olwen is the one who's not gone. Anyway, we then get the actual thing where Helm criticizes him for being fat, and then, of course, he gets mad, and somebody says, he's just making a joke. And then he tries to proffer his son as a marriage material for Hera, and Helm basically says who she marries is none of your business. And in the context of this, Freka says that there's a rumor going around that Gondor is, some Gondorian lord is basically a suitor for her hand. Helm doesn't deny this, but there's also, in the midst of this whole idea from Freka that we're just Gondor's lapdog, and we need to unite Rohan, and we need to be strong on our own and all this. And I'm like, why is Rohan not united? Like, this doesn't ever get addressed or explained in the movie. There's no reason why it's not united. It's not like Rohan is a bunch of tribes that are kind of loosely confederated together. That's... And we never get any explanation for this, so it's just kind of a weird comment that makes no sense. And the whole Gondorian lord thing is just made up. That's not in the book. But anyway, he offers this as a way to make Rohan strong by uniting Rohan, which is like, how's it not united unless you're trying to divide it by making this extortion claim, basically, against the king? So it's just kind of just not smart on his part. But anyway, it starts going down. Wolf expresses his desire to get married to Hera. Hera is trying to tell him no, and Helm, of course, is just mad about the whole thing. And basically, he's about to wallop Freka, but then Freylof, who we've already been introduced to, I think, before this point, but he basically comes up and tells Helm not here, and Helm basically says, yeah, you're right, king shouldn't brawl in his own house, but outside men are freer, which actually is, that line basically is straight out of the book, and that's how he basically tells Freka, we're going to go outside and handle this. Now in the book, Helm is actually more aggressive than he is here, because in the book, basically Helm like forces Freka outside so he can face him mano a mano, and his Freka's following, he basically tells, y'all leave us alone for a minute, and because his own guard is there and they outnumber him, Freka's men are just like, okay. In the movie, it just, everybody is accepting the fact that they're just going to have a fist fight, apparently. And it's not clear why, but anyway, they go outside, and Freka does basically sound, he says, I don't remember if it's before or after they get outside, that Helm doesn't command the loyalty that he thinks he does, which is like open sedition. And so it's like, by rights, he should probably just get executed by now, but they're just going to handle it by fist fight, apparently. So anyway, they have a little bit of a conversation. Meanwhile, Hera and Wolf are still back in the main hall talking to each other, and Hera mentions the fact, that she doesn't want to get married to anybody. And she doesn't want to be forced into a marriage. And Wolf takes it real personally, and he's like, why is marrying me so terrible? Don't you still like me? Because apparently they knew each other as kids. And we end up getting a scene where we see them playing as kids. But even in that scene later, we'll get a line from Wolf like, you should go before my dad finds you here. Which, why? I mean, like, have they always been that hostile, and yet they're still? It's kind of weird. But anyway, they're talking about their past and whatnot. Hera refuses him, basically saying, "I don't want to marry anybody, girl boss." And Wolf takes it personally. Well, Holith shows up and basically says, "Come on, we're going to miss all the fun," meaning the fist fight. So they go outside, and they're just about to get started, and I don't remember exactly what all the words were that passed between the two, but in this version of the story, unlike in the book, Freka throws the first punch. He actually hits Helm in the face, and then he punches him in the gut, and then Helm just kind of stands back up, and he says something, and then he slugs Freka one time, knocks him to the ground, and he's dead. And then after that, Wolf runs up to him, and he finds out that he's dead, and he says as much, and Helm basically says, "That's impossible. I only hit him the once. You all saw." Which, again, is kind of changing the nature of what's going on in this story, because in the book, you very definitely get the impression that he kind of intended to kill the guy. Like, he wasn't like, "Oh, I hit him once and he died. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that." Whereas he is in the movie. But the nature of how all this sets up the conflict is so weird, because as opposed to the book, where it's all kind of a political ploy to get Freka into power, and they do bring that up in the movie too. Helm says to, I think, Freylof, like, he's not got a noble known bone in his body. He wants to see me and my sons dead and Wolf on the throne. So he's aware of this kind of political maneuvering that he's trying to go for. But the overall thing with the movie is Wolf acts like he really does just want to marry Hera. Now, maybe in the back of his mind, he's also got all these aspirations, and he's not opposed to killing off the competition, as it were. But anyway, Wolf's whole motivation seems kind of strange, because on the one hand, his dad comes in here basically openly rebelling. He's trying to get married, basically, and yet whenever his dad gets killed in a perfectly fair fist fight, fair, I mean, you're going up against Helm Hammerhand, is it really fair? But his dad gets killed, and suddenly it's just all about revenge, and the whole thing just gets kick-started in a weird way. After this, Helm banishes Wolf, because he's the son of basically an open rebel. And after that, we get, apparently some years later down the line, we get some more dialogue, not dialogue, like narrative kind of stuff. And Hera apparently has been wondering about Wolf this whole time, because she still cares for him as a friend. But at any rate, the story basically is that Helm is no longer letting her ride out on her own. She has to have companions with her all the time. So we get a scene where she's riding with Freylof and Leif and Olwen, and they see some things. They end up, apparently there's been things going on the east borders of Rohan that are kind of strange. Noises have been heard, and they come across a dead horse that's been kind of not picked clean, it partially, eaten by birds. And then they also end up finding a dead Southron who has I forget what items they were that referenced. One of them was a horn, and they surmise that he's a beast master. Master of what? Oliphant. If you've seen the trailer, you know this is coming. There's an Oliphant. And all of this is just kind of like, there's just weird things going off on the border. Now, in the book, if you remember, what happens is Gondor gets invaded from the east and south, and then also Rohan gets invaded as part of that. And as a result of all this, Wolf sees his opportunity to come in and claim the kingship of Rohan. Here, what we end up getting the idea of is that Wolf is allying with people in the south to attack Rohan, and Gondor's apparently just not connected at all, which is just kind of weird. Because how do you get past Gondor from the south and then get into Rohan? Kind of weird. And they act actually like at one point that, Mumakil just kind of wander around in herds all the time, and it's totally normal, which doesn't make any sense at all. But anyway, they see this, and then the Oliphant comes out, and the Oliphant seems like it's rabid. Like, it just seems in a rage, and it's also got some of its skin missing for totally unknown reasons. And it creates a bad situation because it's trying to like stampede down these four characters. Well, Freyalof tries to attack it with a sword in kind of a similar way that Eowyn does at the Pelennor Fields in the movies. But it doesn't really work, and then he's on the run, and Hera grabs the horn from the Beastmaster, dead Beastmaster, blows the horn and gets the Oliphant to chase her into the woods. And then Freyalof is like, doesn't she know what creature's in there? And Olwen's like, of course she does. And you're wondering, what is going on here? Are we talking about Ents? No, we're not talking about Ents. If you've seen the trailer, you already know. We're talking about the Watcher in the Water, which she goes to this pool and recites apparently some line about dark water, beware dark water that hides old secrets or something like that. And she throws something into the water. I think it was the spear from the Beastmaster that she throws into the water to kind of wake it up. And then somehow this giant Oliphant has snuck up behind her and almost gets her. But anyway, she basically uses this opportunity to have the Watcher in the Water get the Oliphant. Which, let me tell you, the Watcher like swallows the Oliphant whole, which is just nuts. But anyway, this is one of those subplots that's not connected to anything. It's like there's no reason really for this subplot. We didn't need this. Why did we need a Watcher in the Water? And then, who does she meet in the woods after this is all over but Targ, the general from Dunland? And he's like, I haven't seen that in ages. And they're having kind of a friendly conversation. And he mentions that he serves the new High Lord of the Rohirrim, not Rohirrim, the Dunlandings. And she's like, they have no High Lord. And she says, they do now. And then he has this guy come up behind her and put a bag over her head and they kidnap her. And they take her to Isengard. And this actually makes some sense because the Dunlandings do take over Isengard and all that. So that's a thing. That actually does happen in the story. But she gets taken there. Apparently, Freyalof, Olwen, and Leif managed to follow the trail there somehow, even though how would they even find out where she went? And I don't know. Anyway, they figure this out. She wakes up. She sees that there's some kind of plans involving Rohan. Then Wolf comes in, and she sees this little seal, by the way, which looks like a serpent in a coil. That'll come up later. And Wolf is basically telling her, I'm gonna take over Rohan. And she's like, no. And he's like, what if there was a chance that you could save your people by basically marrying me? And she says, well, if I did, would you, leave them be? And he says, if you're so arrogant. And it's just like, dude, you're basically blackmailing her into marrying you, and you're mad that she says if. So Wolf's character is very, very emotional and unstable, let's just say. Anyway, Olwen, Freyalof, and Leif do manage to rescue her. They make it back, and then they're having a council with Helm, and Freyalof is basically saying we should hole up in Dunharrow and Helm's Deep and whatever until we can gather our full strength to fight these guys. And Helm's like, nope, we're just going to attack them now. I should also mention, by the way, that Wolf, in his conversation with Hera, said, you're not going to get any help from Gondor because Helm's too proud to ask for help. This is also a weird thing to say because in the book, it doesn't say exactly whether they called for help or anything like that, but it does say that Gondor was not able to help because it was also under invasion at the time. This could have been introduced into the story so easily, just a reference, but they didn't do it. They just turned it into like Helm's too proud to go ask for help. And I'm not a fan of that, the way they kind of changed that up. But anyway, at the council, they're arguing about what to do. Freyalof says, we should hold up until we gather our full strength. Helm is not for this plan. And there's this other Lord, Thorn, who's like, Freyalof is young. He hasn't seen you in battle. I pledged 300 spears to guard the east flank. And then Freyalof gets told basically to go, not banished exactly, but told by Helm to go to Dunharrow, dig some ditches and crawl in them because he's a coward. And this is also something I really don't like about the story. It's like that was completely unnecessary. But Helm ends up basically deciding we're just going to ride out and meet him. They end up, of course, deciding to do this. They get ready, and they see the Dunlanding army coming, and they're not stopping, and it's almost nighttime. And Hera mentions that Dunlandings are, kind of known for attacking under cover of night, and they're planning to attack, tonight. So they're getting ready to go out there. And as they're forming the line, Helm notices that, or not Helm, maybe it was Holleth, but somebody notices that Thorne's men are not out there on the eastern flank. Meanwhile, in the city, Hera notices, because Leaf trips and falls, and drops a bunch of pledges, apparently pledges of men, I don't know. And she sees one of the seals is a serpent, and she says, "Whose is this?" And he says, "That's Lord Thorne's." It's the same one that she saw in Isengard. So at this point, she knows that they're going to be betrayed, and so she's like, "We need to evacuate the city." So everybody starts evacuating the city. She ends up having, all this go on while she tries to form a distraction kind of at the gates, because basically what happens is, while they're out there, the main Dunlending army is being engaged. Wolf comes around with Oliphant and some other stuff, and he's trying to just go for the city itself, which is now undefended, of course. So she's trying to manage that a little bit, and then Helm, Holleth, and Hama, and some of their other men, they come back to the city to try to guard it or whatever. They find that it's already been evacuated, and parts of it they just start burning to resist the Oliphant, which is trying to knock down the gate. And Hera, who is now trying to get out by getting her horse, gets confronted by Lord Thorne in the stables, and he's about to kill her. But she ends up killing him partially through luck. But at any rate, the whole thing goes down. They do end up having to leave. Holleth gets killed in Edoras, as he actually ends up on an Oliphant and kills it by hacking its neck with an axe. And then he gets shot through the throat by, I think it's Wolf. But anyway, they're all leaving. Hama, who is on a slow horse, which Hera had already mentioned earlier, you should ride a faster horse. It's not really clear why he's on a slow horse. It's kind of strange for a battle. But anyway, he's on a slow horse, so he's falling behind. Eventually, the horse just kind of gives out, and he's like, okay, well, I'm just going to dismount, and I'm going to shoot at my enemies. And later, when we see everybody get at Helm's Deep, she notices that he's missing. By the way, Helm also gets shot up in the middle of this, but isn't dead. And Wolf and General Targ bring Hama up and basically have him as a captive. And Helm's like, "Look, you've won. I'll surrender. Just don't kill Hama." And he's like, "Nope." And he kills Hama in front of him. Now, the reason I mention some of this is because in the story, Hama actually is supposed to fall before the doors of Edoras. Or maybe it's Holleth, but I'm pretty sure it's Hama. And I really wished that they had actually done it that way, because it would have been a really nice last stand moment for him, instead of having it happen this way, which was just kind of unnecessarily brutal. But there's a lot of last stand moments in Tolkien, so it would have been nice to see that. At any rate, now they're all holed up in Helm's Deep. Wolf is, holding them in with the siege, and he claims the kingship of Rohan. And in Helm's Deep, it's not known as Helm's Deep yet, of course, but you all know what I mean. In Helm's Deep, they're kind of taking stock of supplies, and Hera finds this box and opens it up, and there's like a dress in it and a kind of like a circlet of leaves. And she's wondering what it is, and there's this old crone in there who's like, says she's been keeping these halls for however many years, and she says, "Don't touch that, it's a wedding dress for one of the lords of the Hornburg," because his wife, was going to marry him, but then the night before they got married, she died of a strange fever. And this is another one of those subplots that just doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's like, why are we adding this in here? Meanwhile, Helm is on not his deathbed, but he's wounded, and they're caring for him, and Olwen mentions that his body is healing, but he's not waking up, and she fears that it's his mind that's broken. Well, lights go out, and next thing you know, Hera wakes up. She'd kind of fallen asleep, lying on, next to him, and he's gone. And we get this whole business about, Helm going out and killing people, and they think that he's a wraith, which is not exactly what it says in the book. In the book, it's just, if he held no weapon, then no weapon would bite him. And there's no indication that anybody ever thought that he was dead or a wraith or anything like this, but they kind of amp it up a little bit for the movie, which kind of works, but I also find kind of annoying. Well, it turns out there's like this secret passage that you can get out through from his bedchamber in the Hornburg, and that's how he got out without anybody seeing it, and he's just out there, tearing people up with his bare hands. But anyway, she finds this by accident at some point and comes out. And when she comes out, there's two orcs there talking about something, and apparently they're gathering rings. And of course, this is where in the trailer we get the line, "What is Mordor want with rings?" Which again, totally unnecessary subplot. Well, she ends up coming out at some point. I don't remember exactly the reason that she did or whatever, but she comes out, and turns out they also have a troll with them, which ends up being a problem. She almost gets herself killed, but Helm shows up and rescues her. And nobody's known where Helm was this whole time because, like, they didn't know. They were trying to figure out, where did Helm go? He's been out here this whole time. And it's not really clear how much time has passed either. But he's out there. He ends up taking care of the orcs and fist fights the troll, but he's not doing a whole lot of damage to it. And the troll's tearing him up pretty good. But she ends up killing the troll by throwing a spear through its eye. And then he, basically says, okay, well, we got to get back into the Hornburg, so we got to get to the gate. It's the only way back in. They go to the gate, and they're being chased by Wolf because they hear this. Wolf and Targ hear the sounds of the troll dying and whatnot, and they end up following and finding out, that he's there, and they follow him up. He's running up the causeway with Hera, and they try to get the gate open. The gate is basically frozen shut. Well, Helm, being the most awesome guy ever, basically pulls it apart by himself, which is a really nice touch. I gotta say, really demonstrating the strength there. But at any rate, this all happens, and then he gets her in, but then closes the door. It's like, why didn't you open it just a little more and get yourself in? It's kind of weird. And she says, I need you, Rohan needs you, and he says, no, they need you. And this is where we get that line that I criticized from the trailer about how, my pride, my joy, you could rule the world. And it's kind of in the context of basically saying, I was wrong to kind of treat you as just a girl and not, one of the boys, which I also found kind of annoying. But it's still just kind of this weird thing to say, in my opinion, and I still don't like it. It's not as bad in its context, but whatever. So at any rate, this all happens. He stands guard over the door, basically, and just is fist fighting everybody who comes to get him. And the next morning, there he is, frozen. And that's kind of like how it happens in the book, but not exactly. Wolf, meanwhile, is building this huge siege tower to try to get in. And basically what happens from here, we get more kind of strange subplots, because Hera's plan to give everybody hope is to get Helm's armor to Freylof in Dunharrow by means of asking the eagle, who's apparently way up in the mountain crags. And so she has to climb up there and ask the eagle to do this, and the eagle does, takes it to Freylof, and then we don't really see what happens with Freylof after that, but we do get a brief scene with him. And she has all the Rohirrim trying to escape through the caves to get out to Gondor, hopefully. Well, all this goes down, and she decides that she's going to distract Wolf by basically facing him alone, and she's going to do it in the wedding dress that they found earlier. Like I say, this subplot is just kind of weird. Well, she ends up doing this, challenging him to one-on-one combat, saying, look, if I win, you leave, and if you win, then you get to be king. He's like, why would I agree to that? But of course his pride overcomes him, and he does it anyway. Well, they fight, of course. And Olwen is also fighting off some of the guys trying to come across the bridge from the siege tower. And so we get some of this going on, and they're having their little fight, and the archers of the Rohirrim are trying to burn down the bridge so that they can't get in. More of them can't get in to follow all the escapees, basically. And eventually, we get the resolution of the battle. Freylof shows up, all that stuff. But, most of that is fine. Wolf ends up getting killed by Hera, which is, I'm pretty sure in the book it actually says Freylof is supposed to kill him, but, whatever, no big deal. And we get a bunch of other stuff. There's other plot points that are kind of invented and not unnecessary so much, but, they're just kind of part of the story as they had to fill in details. But these are kind of the big ones that were major changes. After this, Freylof does become king, and he ends up telling Hera, it should have been you. And she's like, I never wanted a crown. It's like, well, no, like, it was never going to pass to her. That's just not the way that was going to work. But then we also get this scene where he's there and Leaf introduces the new Master of Isengard, which of course is Saruman, and we get like one line out of Saruman. It's no big thing. And then he meets her as she's about to leave. Freyloff meets her as she's about to leave, and she apparently got an unexpected invitation, and so she's going off, and then Olwen joins her, and she says, well, you're no longer bound to my service. And she's like, I know, where are we going? A very Frodo-Sam moment. But anyway, she says, there's a wizard who is curious about the orcs that I found that were stealing rings. Can you guess who the wizard is? Yes, you can. It's Gandalf. So again, they just throw in that little memberberry there. So yeah, I mean, there are things in the movie that are kind of annoying that they changed up or added in for no particularly good reason. Most of it is fine, though, and a lot of it is pretty accurate. So there's the spoilers section. As I said, my overall thoughts at this moment are about a 7 out of 10. So pretty good movie as a movie. If you're looking for just straight up accuracy to Tolkien, it's probably closer to a 6 out of 10. But, you know, worth a watch, at least, if you're a fan of Middle-earth at all, because it is at least pretty good and enjoyable. That said, that is my review of the Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. There's other stuff I could mention, but this is already way too long, so I won't get into all of it. But if you did enjoy it, please do give a thumbs up, share around, make sure you subscribe to catch all my future content. If you're on YouTube, click that bell icon. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions, and check out the other support and social links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.